Okay, so today we're going to talk about colonial wars and eventually the French and Indian War. Now, there's going to be a series of wars between Britain and France and other European powers. From the Glorious Revolution on, there is King George's War, Queen Anne's War, King William's War. It's just European powers often going to war over territory, colonies, or just going to war. But the war that's going to affect the future of the United States the most is going to be the French and Indian War, sometimes known as the 7 Years' War. So we're going to do this fairly quickly, maybe 20, 25 minutes. So in 1749, some French scouts started proceeding down the Allegheny and the Ohio rivers to spy out land. This is, of course, nowadays Ohio, Iowa, Michigan, places like that, looking to claim this land in the name of France. What they would do is they would put in lead plates into the ground saying this was French, and then they were going to build a chain of forts throughout the region. Well, when the news of the French moving into the region reached Williamsburg, Virginia, the governor sent out an emissary to warn off the French. He said, I need somebody to go out into this Ohio territory and tell the French that, hey, this is Virginia land, French stay out. So he needed a volunteer, and he found an ambitious young man by the name of Major George Washington in the Virginia militia, whose older brother owned part of the Ohio Company, which claimed land out in this area. So he volunteered for the mission. So with a few of his companions, Washington made his way to Fort Lebeau, and the French pretty much said, politely, get lost, we're taking this land. Then the governor, when heard this news, sent out a small force to erect a fort at the strategic fork where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers meet to form the Great Ohio, which you can go actually stand in that spot right now. It's really amazing. If you get a chance, you should do it. Well, no sooner than the English started to build their fort, a larger French force appeared, kicked them out, and proceeded to build their own fort called Fort Duquesne, which will later be named Fort Pitt, which of course is Pittsburgh. And if you've ever watched any football or baseball game, they show you the overhead view of Pittsburgh. You can see the confluence of the three rivers. It's pretty amazing. Well, meanwhile, Washington had been organizing a force of volunteers, and in the spring of 1754, he went out with an advance guard and a few Indian allies. And near Great Meadows, they skirmished with a French detachment, which ended in bloodshed. Some of it got out of Washington's control. Some wounded French officer was killed. The French are very angry. Washington is forced to retreat with some prisoners. He's running back very fast. He's being chased, and he knows he's going to be caught. So he builds very quickly a rudimentary fort, which he builds out of necessity, which he eventually calls Fort Necessity. Well, this is, by the way, a trait that's going to benefit Washington for a long, long time, is this idea of being able to run away, because he does a lot of running away during the American Revolution, keeping the army intact. Well, Washington is surrounded at Fort Necessity by a large French force, and he is forced to surrender, oddly enough, on July 4th, 1754. Now, he had to sign a document. He didn't speak French, and he didn't understand what was in the document. It really accused him of acting dishonorably. He had an interpreter who roughly understood some French, but misinterpreted. But Washington signs it to his great embarrassment later. Well, back in London, they had decided that it was time for some sort of showdown with the French in this area, that it's either going to be British territory or French territory. The colonies had already thought of coming up with an idea during what they call the Albany Congress in July of 1754. And the idea pushed forward by Ben Franklin was to create a plan of union of the colonies, which would have a chief executive, a kind of supreme governor, be called the President General of the United Colonies, appointed by the Crown. There would be a Grand Council with 48 members chosen by colonial assemblies. And this federal body would oversee matters of defense, Indian relations, trade, and levy taxes to support its programs. Now, you think about that, if London had gone along with that idea, would the United States ever become independent? Or would we have ended up at some point, and we're just doing counterfactuals where we just sort of guess what could have happened, the what if of history, would we have been the British Commonwealth and then end up a little bit like Canada? Well, like I said, London wants to have a showdown in America. And so in 1755, the British fleet captures Nova Scotia and kicks out most of the French population. These people were known as Acadians, and they would not take an oath to the British Crown. And so many of these Acadians will flee and make their way down to French Louisiana, where they became known as, and somebody may take this guess, as the Cajuns. Acadians is a corrupted form of, Cajuns is a corrupted form of Acadians, whose French descendants still preserve elements of the French language along the remote bayous. So in 1755, a new British commander-in-chief, General Edward Braddock, arrived in Virginia with 2 regiments of regulars, with the addition of some colonial troops, including George Washington as a volunteer staff officer. Washington really wanted to get into the British Army. He wanted to be a regular. He didn't want to be a militia person. He had great respect for Edward Braddock, and there seems to be evidence that Braddock had respect for him as well. Well, Braddock decides he's going to go down and meet the French if he can get near Fort Duquesne. The problem is it's a tough feat of logistics. The old saying is amateurs study tactics, professional soldiers study logistics. They have to march in a fairly straight line, hauling heavy artillery, keeping all of their supplies, and they get within 7 miles of Fort Duquesne when they're suddenly attacked by Native Americans and Frenchmen. They're beset on all sides. They're surrounded. The British forces panic. They retreat in disarray, abandoning most of their artillery and supplies. Braddock is shot and will lose his life. And from all accounts, it was George Washington who showed a lot of bravery in organizing a retreat. The problem is when they started to retreat, they started running into the rest of their line still moving forward. But Washington was able to help get the British regulars safely back to safe territory. Now, they bury Braddock along the way after he died. Washington writes an account of it about how exciting it was to hear the whistle of bullets. Supposedly King George had read that account and said he wouldn't think it was so excited if one of them hit him. And there were bullet holes in Washington's coat and his hat. And so again, doing counterfactuals, what happens if one of those bullets actually hits? Then where's the future of the United States, right? Well, Braddock's defeat is going to expand this war into a colonial dispute, into a worldwide war. And so by 1756, it becomes known as the 7 Years' War in Europe because it goes from 1756 to 1763. Whereas in the United States, we call it the French Indian War because it goes on a little bit longer. So the British are going to be able to conquer the French territories in America because the French had never really encouraged a lot of settlement. So supplies becomes a problem because the British Navy is superior. It was tough at times to deal with their Native American allies. And the French didn't seem to value their North American colony as much as they did their West Indies colony. In fact, the island of Martinique brought in more money than all of French territory in North America, the island of Martinique out in the West Indies. In fact, when they found out that they were going to lose that, I think it was Voltaire who told the king, as well, you just lost a few acres of snow. So they didn't really take it as strong as they could have, but they do lose. And they lose Fort Duquesne, which becomes Fort Pitt, which will eventually become Pittsburgh, named after the famous British Prime Minister. The French will also lose India, but the war is going to drag on to about 1763. And finally, there's the Peace of Paris in 1763, which brings an end to the war and French power in North America. Britain took all French North America possessions east of the Mississippi, except for New Orleans, and all of Spanish Florida. The English invited the Spanish settlers in Florida to remain and practice their Catholic religion, but few accepted the offer. In compensation for the loss of Florida, Spain received Louisiana. The loss of Louisiana left France with no territory on the continent of North America. So the irony of this is that by pursuing all this big victory in North America, it's going to put the British government in motion to a chain of events in which they will lose much of British North America, because the French, being humiliated by this war, will thirst for revenge. They're always looking for a way to get back for this terrible loss. In London, Benjamin Franklin, who was an agent for the colony of Pennsylvania, kept finding the French minister so curious about America and asking, "Hey, is everything okay over there? You guys doing well with the British? Any problems with any controversies? Let us know. You know, we're always here to listen." I just finished a long book on the French and Indian War, and it's just amazing how little the French government valued what they had in North America. And they still lost Martinique and other parts of the West Indies. So what's the impact of this war? Like I said, we did it very shortly. It was not a very in-depth discussion, but after the war, American colonists were feeling very patriotic. They're so happy to be British. They beat the hated French, but there is some resentments after the war and some new problems that come with the heritage of war. American nationalism was starting to begin. People started thinking of themselves and speaking of themselves more as Americans as they did English or British. And Americans started feeling more of a sense of importance because they were part of this world conflict, and a successful world conflict. But many harbored resentment, whether it's fair or not, at the British, especially British soldiers and British generals who seemed to treat them as inferiors. And in many early stages of the war, they lost their awe of British soldiers because they thought British soldiers were just these mighty soldiers who could do everything, but were at such a loss at fighting on the frontier. In fact, recent studies have said that Americans became convinced that they were morally superior to their British allies. Although they admire the courage and discipline of redcoats under fire because you had to stand there and shoot, New Englanders didn't like the carefree cursing that the British soldier did, I guess the better word would be whoring, breaking the Sabbath, the drinking. They just did not like that version of Britain. They said they're just so immoral. And they didn't like the punishment system that the British used. The British always believed in lashes, right? You whip people until morale improves. But on the other hand, for the British, they didn't think much of the Americans either, right? The American colonists didn't fight in traditional ways. Often they would run fairly quickly. And there were still American colonists who were continually trading with the enemy for the money that it brought in. Well, so there is that tension that's going on here. And then it gets worse. The British government issues the Proclamation of 1763, which really much prevents the colonists from settling west of the Appalachians. Well, for Britain, this purpose is primarily is to keep the peace. They had just fought a long war. It was an expensive war. And the last thing they need is the colonists going over and starting wars with the Native Americans. Well, for the colonists, this was too much to bear because they thought, their opinion was that they went and fought this war so that they could go out and settle all this area. And one thing we learn about Americans is that they tend to be conspiracy theorists and smugglers early on. The Americans look at this proclamation line as a way to keep them hemmed in, and that the British are allowing a larger army in the colonies, and they see that as maybe they're just trying to control us. They're keeping us all in one little area so they can control us. Well, in our next lecture, we're going to talk about further impacts of the war, which includes that the war was very expensive. It was very expensive for Great Britain. They're heavily into debt. It's a war that starts in North America, and they believe that at least North America, their colonies here, should pay for some of the costs of that war. So we'll pick up on there the next time.